The Defence Department is becoming increasingly reliant on a growing workforce of outsourced contractors. Data obtained under Freedom of Information laws reveal the contractor workforce has risen to a record 37,000 people. It's a figure 18% bigger than those enrolled in the Army. Joining us live now is Professor Peter Dean. He's a Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the United States Study Centre. Peter, good to see you. Thanks for your time. Why are we seeing that shift? Is it a worrying trend or just a sign of modern times?
Well, it's a combination of a range of things. Under the previous coalition governments, we basically had a cap on the number of public servants that could go into the Defence Department. And under a couple of reviews, areas such as the Capability and Sustainment Group actually went backwards in the terms of the number of public servants they had. At the very same time that defence spending was increasing and the number of major projects that defence was required to deliver on was growing. So we had a lot of projects within the Defence Department. We had a lot of money to deliver on those projects, but not enough workforce. And so one of the ways of solving those issues was to go to contractors. And this was pretty much encouraged by the previous coalition government in terms of its approach to fulfilling those needs in the public sector. And what we've seen is both the Defence Strategic Review and the new government would say they're going to look to put the brakes on this, but that's very difficult to do in the short term. There's a large number of very big defence projects going on, and also combine that with the fact that the actual numbers in the public service, but particularly in uniformed parts of defence, are actually going backwards. And what we're seeing is some real difficulty in the recruitment and retention area. And in fact, it was only late last year, earlier this year, the government was talking pretty much about a workforce crisis in the defence, in our uniformed parts of defence, at the very same time that the Defence Department is supposed to grow under the numbers that were put in place by the Morrison government.
Let's look at one of the big new projects that will get underway soon. We're going to see a new Army brigade being established in Adelaide. As I understand it, it will be operating mobile long-range strike and air defence batteries from there. It means that some combat units are going to be moving, doesn't it, from South Australia to the top end. Why is this shake-up needed?
Look, yeah, this is going to be a bit of a transition for the defence footprint, particularly the Army footprint in South Australia. So what I'd probably expect in the short term is we'll see some new Army units move. It's been reported in the press that, for instance, the 1st Armoured Regiment will move probably most likely to Townsville in the 3rd Brigade. And it looks like the 7th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment and Infantry Battalion will be merged back in with the 5th Battalion up in Darwin to form 5-7, which it had done in the past. Again, this comes back to Armies trying to do a lot with a shrinking number of people. The Defence Strategic Review put this emphasis on long-range fires for Army, really putting Army at the centre of that strategy and bringing up the role and purpose of Army equal to that to Navy and Air Force under that new denial strategy. So what the Army is now is moving very rapidly, and I'd say you have to commend the Chief of Army and his team for how quickly they're moving on this. The decision about the Land 400 Phase 3 infantry fighting vehicles to be at 129 and to set up a brigade, by the looks of it, that will be centred around the 3rd Brigade in Townsville. So that's up in the north of Australia, where it has the ability to be forward deployed into the region quite quickly. And then they'll form in Adelaide to replace those units that are moving, 10th Brigade, which is around the long-range fires that you mentioned. And Adelaide is actually the perfect place to place those units, in particular because of the ranges. We have some really world-class ranges in South Australia. These are very long-range weapons. They require complex military ranges to operate them. And this is one of the few areas in the country and one of the few areas in the regions of the world that really has the distance and the ranges and the types of facilities we need. So you get the best training you can for the long-range HIMARS systems and the surface-to-air NASAM batteries as well in South Australia. And then they're quite easily deployable, these systems, by air, by road and by rail, so they can be quickly moved up into the north as well.
Peter, just on another matter, we've all been bracing for what we've been warned could be a pretty horrific bushfire season. The ADF, as we know, is on standby to help, and we're all very used to those images of Defence Force personnel swinging in to help with these emergency scenarios. But as we've discussed before in this program, there are a lot of issues with that in terms of relying on ADF personnel to fill that emergency services role. Is the government actually making any real moves to try and rely less on those ADF personnel in those emergency scenarios? How do you see a way through in terms of making everyone happy and making sure that our requirements are met when needed.
Yeah, look, it looks like we're going to come into what potentially could be a horrendous bushfire season given the weather conditions that we have. And we have seen an over-reliance on the ADF for those because of the types of capabilities they can bring to bear, such as the helicopters that we're seeing in addition here now. But fundamentally, what we've seen through COVID, bushfires, floods, and other things is that the ADF has been constantly pulled away from its primary tasking. It is, after all, the Australian Defence Force, not the Australian Domestic Disaster Relief Force. So while it's there, as the DSR said, it should be the force of last resort. And what it really is beholden on the Commonwealth to start interacting and working better. Ultimately, the front line of defence for bushfires, for floods and other natural disasters actually should be state and local governments. So the emphasis really has to be put on what are those state and local governments doing to better prepare to put more of their own resources in, rather than relying on the Commonwealth government and the ADF coming to support them. Now, of course, it's a key element of any defence force that it does provide domestic assistance and relief when required. But again, it should be that force of last resort. The ADF is working in a very complex international environment. It is also the nation's first response call for any regional emergencies, from humanitarian assistance and disaster relief right through to combat operations. And the more time they spend on these domestic operations, it starts to, as the parliamentary inquiry just laid down, it starts to impact on their warfighting capabilities. And that ultimately then affects our ability to do deterrence, and ultimately that affects our ability to keep our nation safe. So what we need is a rebalancing within the Federation around where the emphasis and onus on these goes. We need better coordination between the Commonwealth and the states, better coordination across the states, and a better system in place. And as we saw with some of these disasters in recent times, the local government and state-based systems didn't prove overly effective. So there's lots of improvements in lots of areas to be done. But ultimately, we should be investing more resources into the front line of doing that preparation, and also specifically design capabilities to respond to things like bushfires. Because ultimately, the ADF is not actually trained to do this type of work. It's not its primary role. So you actually find that if we had more regional and rural fire service personnel, more SES personnel, would be better placed to meet these responses.